We are finally in the 4th arc of this anime/game, and Sumeru is going to be a great ride lore-wise. But in this video, let's take a step back and take a look at something that has sort of been pivotal in the story but not often talked about and is somehow still shrouded in mystery. We have seen 3 of them so far, and they are currently the main goal of the primary antagonists. Despite all that though, what exactly is a Gnosis? Before we get into that, if you want to see more Genshin Impact content, do consider subscribing as we post weekly content on lore and other stuff. Now, the Gnosis has been the main focus of the Harbingers, and throughout the story they have either forced, lucked, or contracted their way into getting them. Despite this, we know very little about the Gnosis themselves or why they are being collected by the Cryo Archon. So let's start with what we know first. The Gnosis were given out to the Archons after the original 7 won the Archon War. They serve as symbols of their victory as well as a connection to Celestia itself. The word Gnosis itself is very likely a reference to Gnosticism, a belief in the real world that humans have a piece of divine contained within them. The word Gnosis actually means wisdom or knowledge, and in the Chinese translations, they essentially mean magical foci, something that can focus magical powers. Now, in the context of the story, we don't see the Gnosis really do much. In fact, of the 3 we've seen, only the Gnosis was said to have been used at all. The Anemo Gnosis was in Venti's possession, but he didn't really make much of an effort in re-obtaining it after it was stolen and seemed to have just have it on his person without using it. The Electro Gnosis owned by A was passed off to her friend Yaemiko for safekeeping almost 100 years ago, as she also seemed to have not used it for anything. Much like Venti, she wasn't even that bothered with losing it. The Gnosis, however, was actually used by Zhongli in the production of Mora, and he mentioned that he could no longer continue producing it once he passed off his Gnosis. If the Gnosis did not grant the Archons any special abilities, maybe it allowed them to wield or channel their elemental powers, much like how visions are for humans. It's even mentioned by Venti that visions are considered primitive by comparison, so this should be a reasonable assumption to make, right? The thing is that none of the 3 Archons seem to be hindered at all when it comes to wielding their elemental powers after the loss of their Gnosis. In fact, Raiden A was even strong enough to fight for hundreds of years against her Raiden Shogun puppet and got even stronger. So it certainly doesn't seem that the loss of the Gnosis caused a loss in their abilities to access their respective elemental powers. Zhongli does mention, however, that while he can still throw rock spears, he has felt a decrease in his overall power. And this is the hint that kind of tells us what the Gnosis might actually be. I think that the Gnosis isn't what allows the Archons to channel their elemental powers, but rather is an energy source. The Gnosis is more likely a battery of sorts that amplifies the abilities of the Archons that wield them and enhances whatever other abilities they already have. Elemental powers of the Archons are supercharged, and instead of a strong wind, with a Gnosis, Venti could potentially summon a category 5 hurricane. In addition, each of the Archons represent a particular aspect, like freedom, contracts, or eternity, and the Gnosis likely amplifies them as well. This is what allows Zhongli to both produce Mora and amplify his Geo powers, and why he couldn't produce Mora after he lost the Gnosis, but could still bend the Geo element. Aside from that, there is something that happens in Sumeru that further lends to this theory as well. If you haven't played through the main story, then consider this a spoiler warning. In the story, we learn that the Akasha, the tool that feeds knowledge to the people of Sumeru, is in fact powered by the Dendro Archon's Gnosis. In the way that it functions here, it doesn't seem as though it grants the people of Sumeru access to the Dendro element, but it's just a battery that powers the Akasha. However, at this time, we don't know the full details of this, so the Gnosis could serve some other functions like storing all the information for the Akasha instead. All we know for sure is that the Akasha functions with the power of the Gnosis. If the Gnosis is indeed just a godly power source, the Tsaritsa may be collecting these Gnosis to power up something rather than just using them as a weapon. We don't really know the full functionality of the Gnosis at this point, but a battery seems to fit the use cases of the Gnosis we've seen so far. For something that seems quite pivotal to the story, we know very little about the Gnosis. Once we get more of the story from Sumeru, we might be able to make a bit more of an educated guess, but until then, we'll just have to wait. But that does it for this video though, and if you enjoyed the content, do consider subscribing and comment below what you think the Gnosis actually is, and I'll see you in the next one. As usual, have a good day.